History is written by the victors. In the West, our understanding of the Second World War is dominated by the beaches of Normandy, the sands of North Africa, or the jungles of the Pacific. We know the heroes and we know the villains. There's a massive frozen blind spot in our collective memory. That's the Eastern Front. This was a war of annihilation, fought on a scale so vast and brutal that it defies imagination. And because of the stigma of defeat, the voices of the ordinary German soldiers who froze and bled in the Russian snow were often silenced, dismissed, or simply lost to time. In this video, I'm reading an excerpt from Guy Sajer's masterpiece, The Forgotten Soldier. It is one of the most raw, terrifying, and controversial accounts of the war ever written. A glimpse into a nightmare that history almost forgot. We had to wait until the following day before we could use the reserve of 5 gallons of gas, which Ernst was able to draw. We were about to leave when an unexpected and unpleasant sound struck our ears. In the distance, still quite far away, we heard the booming of big guns. As we thought we were by now far from the front, we were both astonished and alarmed. We didn't know, and I didn't know until much later, that our course had been taking us parallel to the Belgorod-Kharkov line. Nonetheless, after unloading 2 dying men to make room for 3 more wounded, we set off without delay. In the middle of that afternoon, everything went wrong again. Our truck was more or less in the middle of a column of 10. We had just passed an armored unit whose tanks looked like a giant version of the slimy creatures that emerge on mudflats at low tide. They must have been on their way to meet the enemy, who seemed to be very close. We could hear artillery on our left, despite the loud laboring noises of the trucks. Ernst and I exchanged anxious looks. We were stopped by some soldiers who were setting up an anti-tank gun. "Dig in, fellows," shouted an officer as we slowed down. "Ivan's getting pretty close." This time, at least, they were telling us something. But I wondered how the Russians, who had been left some 90 miles behind, could already be in this district. Ernst, who was driving, stepped on the gas. 2 other trucks did the same. Suddenly, 5 planes appeared in the sky, at a moderate altitude. I pointed them out to Ernst. "They're yaks," he shouted. "Take cover." We were surrounded by bare mud, with occasional clumps of stunted brush. There was a sound of machine gun fire from the sky. The column drove more quickly toward a shallow fold in the ground, which might give some protection. I was leaning out the window, trying to see through the flying mud spun up by our tires. 2 Focke-Wulfs had appeared and had shot down 2 of the yaks, which crashed far to the west. Until the final stages of the war, Russian aircraft were no match for the Luftwaffe, even in Prussia, where the Russian air power was its most active. The appearance of one of the Messerschmitt 109s or Focke-Wulfs would make a dozen armored Ilyushin bombers turn and run. At this period, when German air power still possessed important reserves, the lot of the Russian pilots was not enviable. 2 of the 3 remaining yaks had taken flight, pursued by our planes. When the last dived straight at the convoy, one of the Focke-Wulfs was chasing him, and it was plainly trying to get him in his sights. We reached the dip in the road. The Soviet plane had come down very low to use its machine guns. The trucks ahead of us had stopped short, and the able-bodied were jumping down into the mud. I was already holding the door open, and I jumped with my feet together, plunging face downward when I heard the machine guns. With my nose in the mud, my hands on my head, and my eyes instinctively shut, I heard the machine gun and the 2 planes through a hellish intensity of noise. The sound of racing engines was followed by a loud explosion. I looked up to watch the plane with the black crosses on its wings regain altitude. 300 or 400 yards away where the yak had crashed, there was a plume of black smoke. Everyone was getting up again. "One more who won't give any trouble," shouted a fat corporal who was clearly delighted to be still alive. Several voices joined in a cheer for the Luftwaffe. "Anybody hit?" one of the non-coms called out. "Let's get going then." I walked over to the Tatra, trying to brush off the worst of the mud that clung to my uniform. I noticed 2 holes in the door I had opened to get out, which appeared to have swung shut on its own momentum. 2 round holes, each outlined by a ring of metal from which the paint had been scraped away. Nervously, I pulled open the door. Inside, I saw a man I shall never forget. a man sitting normally on the seat, whose lower face had been reduced to a bloody pulp. "Ernst," I asked in a choking voice. "Ernst." I threw myself at him. "Ernst, say something." I looked frantically for some features on that horrible face. I was nearly crying. Outside, the column was getting ready to leave. The 2 trucks behind me were impatiently blowing their horns. "Hey," I ran to the first of the trucks. "Stop, come with me, I've got a wounded man." I was frantic. The doors of the truck behind me swung open and 2 soldiers stuck out their heads. "Well, young fellow, are you going to move or aren't you?" "Stop," I shouted louder than ever. "I've got a wounded man." "We have 30, one of the soldiers shouted back. "Get going, the hospital isn't too far from here." Their voices rose over mine in the noise of their trucks, which had pulled out, and were passing me. They drowned my cries of desperation. Now I was alone with a Russian truck loaded with wounded men and Ernst Neubach, who was dead or dying. "You shits, wait for me! Don't go without us!" I burst into tears and gave way to a mad impulse. I grabbed my Mauser, which I'd left in the truck. My eyes were swimming and I could barely see. I felt for the trigger and, pointing the gun at the sky, fired all 5 cartridges in the magazine, hoping that to someone in the trucks this would sound like a cry for help. But no one stopped. The trucks continued to roll away from me, sending out a spray of mud on each side. In despair, I returned to the cabin and ripped open my kit to look for a package of dressings. "Ernst," I said, "I'm going to bandage you. Don't cry." I was insane. Ernst wasn't crying. I was. His coat was covered with blood. With the dressings in my hand, I stared at my friend. He must have been hit in the lower jaw. His teeth were mixed with fragments of bone, and through the gore I could see the muscles of his face contracting, moving what was left of his features. In a state of near shock, I tried to put the dressing somewhere on that cavernous wound. When this proved impossible, I pushed a needle into the tube of morphine and jabbed ineffectually through the thickness of cloth. Crying like a small boy, I pushed my friend to the other end of the seat, holding him in my arms and soaking in his blood. 2 eyes opened, brilliant with anguish, and looked at me from his ruined face. "Ernst," I laughed through my tears. "Ernst!" He slowly lifted his hand and put it on my forearm. Half choked with emotion, I started the truck and managed to begin moving without too great of a jolt. For a quarter of an hour, I drove through the web of ruts with one eye on my friend. His grip on my arm tightened and eased in proportion to his pain, and his death rattle rose and fell, sometimes louder than the noise of the truck. Choking back my tears, I prayed, without reason or thought, saying anything that came into my head. "Save him, save Ernst, God. He believed in you. Save him. Show yourself." But God did not answer my appeal. In the cab of a gray Russian truck, somewhere in the vastness of the Russian hinterland, a man and an adolescent were caught in a desperate struggle. The man struggled with death, and the adolescent struggled with despair, which is close to death. And God, who watches everything, did nothing. The breath of the dying man passed with difficulty through that horrible wound, making huge bubbles of blood and saliva. I considered every possibility. I could turn back and look for help, or force the men I was carrying to tend Ernst, at gunpoint if necessary, or even kill Ernst, to cut short his sufferings. But I knew very well I couldn't kill him. I had not yet been obliged to fire directly at anyone. My tears had dried, leaving the trace of their passage on my filthy face to betray my weakness to the world. I was no longer crying, and my feverish eyes stared at the knob on the radiator 2 meters in front of me, which cut hypnotically into the interminable horizon. For long moments, Ernst's hand would tighten on my arm, and each time I was overwhelmed by fresh panic. I couldn't look at that horrifying face. Several German planes passed overhead through the cloudy sky, and in a desperate attempt at telepathy, every fiber in my body appealed to them for help. But maybe they were Russian planes. It didn't matter. I had no time to spare. No time to spare. The expression assumed its full significance, as so many expressions do in wartime. Ernst's hand gripped my arm convulsively. The pressure continued for so long that I slid my foot off the accelerator and stopped, afraid of the worst. I turned and looked at the mutilated face, whose eyes seemed to be fixed on something the living can't see. Those eyes were veiled by a curious film. My heart was pumping so hard that I felt actual physical pain. I refused to believe what I could guess without difficulty. "Ernst!" I shouted. From the back of my truck, my shout was answered by several others. I pushed my companion down on the seat, imploring heaven to let him live, but his body fell heavily against the other side of the cabin. Death. He was dead. Ernst, Mama, help me. In a delirium of terror, I leaned against the truck door and let myself drop, trembling, onto the running board. I tried to persuade myself that none of this was happening, that it was all a nightmare from which I would wake to see another horizon. As I sat and thought, I still had no idea of the extent of irredeemable evil. I dreamed of what life would be like when I shook off this horrible nightmare in which my friend had just died, but my eyes could see only mud sucking at my boots. Two heads looked out from the back of the truck. They were saying something, but I didn't hear them. I stood up and, turning my back on them, walked off a short distance. That small physical effort reawakened some sense of life and hope, and I tried to tell myself that all of this wasn't really serious, that it was only a bad dream I had to forget. I tried to impose an expression of smiling derision on my features. Two of the wounded men jumped down from the truck to relieve themselves. I stared at them unseeing, while the vitality of being alive beat back the darkness. I began to think with hope that surely all the German soldiers in Russia would be sent to help us, that something must be coming to help us. Suddenly, I thought of the French. They were already on their way. All of our newspapers said so. The first Legionnaires had already set out. I had seen the photographs. I felt a hot flush run through me. Ernst would be avenged, that poor fool who would never hurt a fly, who had spent his time making life more endurable for wretched soldiers shaking with cold. In his marvelous hot showers, the French would come, and I would run to embrace them. Ernst had loved them like his own compatriots. This surge of hope and joy could not be dampened by facts. I didn't know, like the fact that the French had decided on quite another course. "What's happened?" asked one of the men whose gray bandage was falling over his eyes. "Are we out of gas?" "No, my friend has just been killed." They looked into the cabin. "Fuck, that's not so bad. At least he didn't have to suffer." I knew that Ernst's agony had lasted for nearly half an hour. "We ought to bury him," one of them said. Three of us lifted out the body, which was already stiffening. I moved like an automaton, and my face was without expression. I saw a small rise of ground, which was less trampled than everywhere else. We took Ernst there. We had no shovels, so we dug the grave with our helmets, rifle butts, and bare hands. I myself collected Ernst's identity tags and papers. The other two were already pushing back the dirt and trampling it down with their boots when I looked my last on that mutilated face. I felt that something had hardened in my spirit forever. Nothing could be worse than this. We pushed in a stick at the head of the grave and hung Ernst's helmets on it. I slit the stick with the point of my bayonet and slid in a piece of paper torn from the notebook Ernst always carried with him. Then, to forestall another emotional crisis, I turned and ran back to the truck. We started off again. One of the wounded had come back to the front of the truck and taken Ernst's place.